Hello and welcome. I'm Eric Tars. I'm the Legal Director at the National Law Center on Homelessness and Poverty, and I am excited to welcome you to this installment in our webinar series on homelessness during COVID-19. Now, more than ever, we are realizing that housing is healthcare and that both housing and healthcare need to be recognized and implemented as human rights for the well-being of our entire society. As you can see, we have an all-star cast with us today, from top UN experts to national advocates, state policymakers, and grassroots organizers. And the thing that brings us all together today is our belief that housing is a human right, and that this is not just an abstract theoretical framework or a rallying cry, but that it is actually talking about housing as a human right is a practical tool that is going to shift the basis of our policy making to one that is more just and equitable and provides accountability where today there's none. So we'll go over our co-presenters' bios as they present, but we are thrilled to have the leading experts here in the field with us today. So we will start off with a brief discussion of some of the history of the work for the human right to housing here in the US. We'll learn about international standards and how they are being used. We'll hear about some of the groundbreaking work here in California to pass a new amendment to the California Constitution that would recognize housing as a human right. And then I'll talk a little bit about what it looks like in practice in places where they are doing this around the globe. Although the participants cannot speak during the webinar, you'll see in your sidebar a comment box in which you can type your questions, and those will be read at the end of the presentation, and we'll be able to respond to them as much time as we have. You can just type them in as the webinar goes along. We may have the ability to do oral questions, which you can indicate your desire to do by raising your hand. That'll be at the end of the presentation, but often technically limited, so probably typing in your questions is the best method, the most reliable method to make sure that they get answered. And that way also we'll have a record of them. If we aren't able to answer them during the presentation, we'll be able to go back and get back to you, follow up after the presentation. Also, please note that this webinar is being recorded and it'll be posted later online. So if you have any concerns about identifying yourself, please be aware that it will be recorded. You will also be able to view the webinar again and share it with others if you find it useful. So if you registered for the webinar and are on the webinar now, we will get you that link later this week. And last but not least, I don't encourage multitasking, but if some of you just have itchy Twitter fingers and want to share some of the brilliant points that are soon to be made by our presenters, please tag us at NLCHP Homeless, and our presenters' Twitter handles will be on slides as we introduce them, so you can tag them too. So with that, I will introduce our Executive Director, Maria Fosterinas, who founded the Law Center back in 1989 to serve as the legal arm of the national movement to end and prevent homelessness. And in 1996, as she'll talk about shortly, she realized that we couldn't achieve our mission until we shifted the culture so that housing is viewed as a human right, and that would move our laws then to be able to actually implement that right in practice. She'll tell you a bit about that journey and where we've come since, and then she'll introduce our next speaker. Maria?
Great, thank you very much, Eric. So I will start with a brief overview of how we came to view the human right to housing as central to our mission to use the power of the law to end and prevent homelessness here in the United States. So as Eric said, in 1996 was a pivotal year. That was the year of a UN conference on the right to housing held in Istanbul, Habitat 2. And I traveled to that conference on behalf of the Law Center and started hearing about and learning about the human right to housing. And I remember thinking, wow, this sounds great. If we really could have the human right to housing here in the United States, this would really help our work end homelessness, instead of having to sort of use sometimes convoluted legal arguments in our legal system, which is known as a system of negative rights. We would have a really powerful positive right, which is exactly what we need to end homelessness and to move forward to ensure that everybody has adequate housing. But, you know, it sounded great, but what did it really mean? It's kind of abstract, the human right to housing. So since that time, we have done a lot of things to figure out what exactly that means, how it can be applied here in the US, and to try to move this conversation and this reality forward and to develop tools. We've done a lot of things since that time, and I think we have come a long way. So we started by holding forums. Every year we hold a national forum on the human right to housing, except this year because of the pandemic, but usually we hold a national forum. We've held local forums, regional forums, to try to engage and build a grassroots network of advocates who know about the right to housing and can use it in their advocacy. We have published reports on the human right to housing to get the word out on what this tool is and what it means. We have testified before UN bodies, and especially once Eric Tars joined our team in, I guess, 14 years ago, we began testifying before the UN and presenting homelessness as an issue of human rights. It's a human rights violation when so many people are literally without any housing in the wealthiest country on earth. And we had specifics of how it's a human rights violation, what we can do about it. We were able to get UN committees to ask our government questions about homelessness and human rights in the United States, and they had to answer. And we were able to use those forums as vehicles to make actual concrete policy change here in the United States. We worked with local advocates on state and local laws to implement and recognize the human right to housing. So we've pursued a lot of different strategies. We've even cited human rights principles in court cases. We've written law review articles to try to build the jurisprudence. So we've approached this from a lot of different angles. And in the past year or so, I feel like we're really starting to see some of the fruits of all of these seeds that we have been planting for literally for decades. So last year, during the presidential campaign, the Democratic candidates, 4 of them specifically spoke about the housing as a right and endorsed the idea that housing is in fact a right and called for its implementation. In the US Congress, Representative Jayapal has introduced legislation on human rights and homelessness, the human right to housing as a way to end homelessness, which we're very excited about and which we support. And at the state levels, we'll hear shortly, Representative Bonta in California has introduced a proposal to amend the California Constitution to include the human right to housing. Efforts are underway in Connecticut as well. So this is an idea that is beginning to enter the policy mainstream, beginning to enter the national debate and the state and local debate, and starting to gain some traction. And a few years ago, we saw how the idea of healthcare as a right began to gain traction and enter the policy mainstream, at least in discussion. And now we are starting to see housing make that entry. Of course, nothing happens by itself in our world, and this will not happen unless we get behind it and really push for it. So, but this is a critical moment, and the pandemic, as Eric mentioned at the start, has made crystal clear how important housing is to all of us, not just to people who lack it, but to every single person. It's really the foundation of what we need and to be fully able to live our lives as human beings. So along this journey, which has been a long one, and we know change takes time and real change takes time, and it takes a lot of us working together, but it can happen if we persist. But along this journey, we've had a number of important allies, and one of our key allies at the international level has been our first speaker, Leilani Farha, who has been a tireless advocate and a longtime friend and ally of the Law Center and of ours and of mine personally. She was, until just a couple of weeks ago, she was the UN Special Rapporteur on the right to adequate housing. She is now Global Director of The Shift, and her work is animated by the principle that housing is a social good, not a commodity, and she has helped develop global human rights standards on the right to housing, including topical reports on homelessness, the financialization of housing, informal settlements, rights-based housing strategies, and the first UN guidelines on the implementation of the human right to housing. She's a central character. She has a film career as well. She's a central character in the film Push, regarding the financialization of housing, which is screening around the world, pandemic allowing currently. In 2017, Leilani launched The Shift with the UN Office of the High Commissioner on Human Rights and the United Cities and local government. She has also, I should mention, very recently developed human rights guidelines on responding to COVID-19 and specific to homelessness and to encampments of homeless people and to evictions. So I'm very happy and thrilled and excited to welcome her to this webinar. Leilani, I'm turning it over to you.
Thank you so much, Maria. Everyone can hear me? Yes, cool. And I just want to say it's really lovely to be in your company, Maria and Eric, your company in particular. I've known you both for a long time. I am huge admirers of your work, and you have inspired my work immensely. You probably, you don't even know. I keep my ear pretty close to your ground because I think you've been incredibly creative, very hostile, incredibly hostile terrain for the right to housing, and the strides you've made really have to go acknowledged, and many of us are following you. I'm really excited to meet Carol. I can't wait to hear you speak. So I'm going to get on with my comments so that I can cede the floor to you and a representative, Bonta, who I think is here too. First of all, I do want to say that I am deeply concerned for all of you in the US. Of course, as a northern neighbor, I live in Canada. We follow the US news very closely and what's happening with COVID in your country, and we are very alarmed, not just by the disease itself and its impact on your population, the disease, but the rollout and fallout, the economic rollout and fallout. So so you know, I stand in solidarity with you, and I'm deeply concerned. I think both Eric and Maria have said, you know, if ever there was a question as to whether housing is a human right or not, the global pandemic has laid that to rest. Never before in contemporary history have the connections between housing and human life and well-being been more transparent. The World Health Organization and governments around the world have in fact reached a global consensus and have recognized the paramountcy of home in protecting society. Stay home, they've said. Physical distance, wash your hands. Of course, this one size health policy doesn't fit all. And as such, I think the pandemic has exposed the many ways in which governments have failed to implement housing as the human right that it is. The over 500,000 people living or more living in homelessness in homelessness in the US obviously can't stay home without one, and those living in shelters can't physical distance and quarantine in congregate settings. After 1 or 2 months of under or unemployment, renters cannot pay the rent because all along it's been too damn high, and renters have no savings. Meanwhile, the deep pocket rich financial investors are crying poor and demanding poor tenants pay the rent or face eviction, if not now because of moratoriums, then after the pandemic crisis ends. Of course, those living in homelessness or housing precarity or in housing that is grossly inadequate, and those of us working in the housing sector have long known why housing is a human right. Human rights are about preserving human dignity. I'm going to take us back to the Universal Declaration of Human Rights in 1948. It was written after the atrocities of World War II. The Declaration recognizes and says very clearly in its preamble that I go back to for every speech. It says clearly that the disregard for human rights results in atrocities, and therefore human rights must be protected by the rule of law. It's very clear right in the preamble. The right to housing is found in international human rights law and many international human rights instruments. It's in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which is the global consensus document on human rights. It's the foundation of all human rights. The right to housing is defined and has been defined by UN human rights bodies and procedures, as well as through its domestic application. And its meaning is quite simple. It's not airy-fairy. It's very straightforward and very simple. It's the right to live somewhere in peace, security, and with dignity. It's the right to have a home and not be left to fend for yourself and your children on a street or in a car or in an institution with rules that wouldn't be imposed on any other population. It's the right to live somewhere that is affordable, where affordability is measured by household income, not what the market can bear. It's the right to housing is the right to live in security, to not have to fear eviction by rich financial actors who want to line their pockets and those of their clients. All of these aspects, and there are more, of the right to housing are only more necessary at this unprecedented time in human history, with a deadly pandemic literally on our doorsteps, for those of us who have a doorstep. And of course, there is real value in implementing housing as a human right. Most obviously, human rights issues demand human rights responses and protections. And that's the point of the Universal Declaration. Human rights also change the way governments interact with people. Those who are homeless or living in inadequate housing are traditionally regarded by governments as recipients or beneficiaries or objects of government charity or charitable programs. But when recognized as rights holders, they are active subjects, empowered to engage and be involved in the decisions that affect their lives and the enjoyment of their rights. This means people living in homelessness and grossly inadequate housing can assist in ensuring any strategies or policies or programs are responsive to their experiences and are thus more effective. Human rights also help to clarify decision-making and accountability, as Eric said in his preambular comments. International human rights law is very clear about who is accountable to whom. All levels of government are accountable to people, particularly marginalized and vulnerable groups. Human rights make it clear that while ensuring access to adequate housing for all involves many actors, it is in fact a legal obligation of states to be both a key actor and a regulator of private actors. We do have an extraordinary opportunity right now to reorient how housing is understood and implemented. As Maria said, I have drafted a series of guidance notes for governments on what different levels of government must do now to ensure everyone has access to adequate housing and well-being, both during the pandemic and in the aftermath of the pandemic. I have heard on Wall Street suggesting that this is a once-in-a-generation opportunity to pick up distressed assets left by the wayside of people who are suffering, and an unprecedented time to turn a profit. What an impoverished view of what COVID-19 has brought us. I am quite certain that this is a once-in-a-generation opportunity, but it is a once-in-a-generation opportunity to make a shift so that housing is understood as home and a universal entitlement. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Leilani. That was fantastic, and I think really helpful in framing our conversation about what the right to housing is, what it isn't, and what it means for our conversation here in the U.S. Now I want to take it from the international level down all the way to the local level, and I'm thrilled to have Carol Fife with us, who is an on-the-ground organizer, educator, mother, and a longtime resident of Oakland, California, where she works as the director of the Alliance for Californians for Community Empowerment in their Oakland office, which is a multiracial, democratic, nonprofit community organization that builds people power to create social, racial, and economic justice. And Carol is also one of the strategic organizing forces behind Moms for Housing, a growing movement with global influence that has shifted the narrative around who deserves housing and redefined the way that people are driving grassroots change for that. She's served in many capacities in many different organizations that you can find her full bio on their website. But at the core of it, everywhere, Carol believes that wherever power is being expressed, the people must be able to express power. And she sees this community organizing and direct action as central to that effort. And we were thrilled when Ace and Carol reached out to us to help turn their call for housing as a human right into actual legislation, into action, resulting in the introduction of California's AB 10, which is going to amend the California Constitution to recognize the human right to housing in line with the standards that Leilani just discussed. So Carol, now if you can tell us a little bit about what this bill means to you and the moms and the others you work with, and why it's so important to be having this conversation about housing as a human right now.
Well, thank you. It's an honor to be on such an impressive panel. So this is great. And so what it means right now, specifically, knowing that we'll be closing on the purchase of Mom's House very shortly, that it makes it a reality for more than just the mothers that were struggling at the center of this particular movement. We always started out with the intention to make housing a reality for everyone who needs it, everyone who wants to have the safety and the shelter of a space. So in the midst of a pandemic, it means that children don't have to worry about where they're going to sleep, where mothers don't have to worry about being able to have their children take baths or wash their hands, where individuals who are who've been exposed to COVID-19 because they live in encampments are concerned about being further exposed or contracting a virus where they don't have the health care to be able to address it appropriately or to shelter in place. When our Black Housing Union did the action around the hotels where the government was supposed to actually place people, the 2 hotels, you know, it was still an issue where we're still struggling to get people sheltered because you can't shelter in place with no place. And I think that's been lifted up by the panelists before me. So it means, in a nutshell, life and death, literally life and death for so many people. And it could be mental health, because even the folks that I know who are working, who had jobs, who are struggling to stay housed without the fear of eviction, because as Leilani said, the rents are too damn high in California anyway. It means not having to have that stress that's constantly weighing on you mentally, with the insecurity of, where will I have a place to stay? If this next rent increase goes through, will I be housed? Will I be able to afford it? So housing as a human right in the state of California, and we hope this sweeps the entire nation, and it's amplified and grows exponentially around the world. It means the difference between life and death for so many people. So we, you know, I'm an organizer, and in this Moms for Housing movement has actually put our organizing in the forefront, which makes me very uncomfortable in a lot of ways. But I also know that it's really, really important. I would prefer to do the actual, like, we're in the war room and we're making plans. What actions are we going to do next? But I also understand the relevance and how it's inspired so many people. So I'm having to struggle with my own introvertism and actually get out there and talk about why this worked, why now, what needs to happen next, how do we grow this movement so it actually catches fire across the world. So I'm inspired and I'm ready to get to the next steps to make this a reality.
Thanks so much for that. I wonder if you can just go in a little bit more detail about, you know, why it's important to you as an organizer, as a mom, you know, whatever identity you want to hold in that moment, for all of them, to not just talk about housing as a social good, a social justice issue, or, you know, an economic issue, but why it's important to talk about it for you as a human right. Why you think that's going to help us get to that next level that you were talking about.
I think it's important, specifically in the United States, where we've had a history, a housing history steeped in racism and systemic racism, to see the outcomes of that in my city, where 70% of the unsheltered folks are African Americans. We can't untangle that from the reality of what we've had to face in this country. And I really truly believe that Black people in the United States are the canary in the mine, and how we treat the least of us is the trajectory for all of us. So we're seeing a situation that was once very, very specific to Black folks impacting everyone. And we don't see the benefits of a trickle-down economic theory, but we are seeing trickle-up experiences of the most impacted, because capitalism is carnivorous and it needs to feed on people. So what it means for me is that the fights that we're involved in, the strategic fights, the legislative fights, the day-to-day struggles that cause us to have to do direct actions, will be minimized because it's recognized in our Constitution that this needs to happen. But I do want to be really, really clear that even though we have AB 10 moving forward, we don't see legislative changes as like the end-all be-all, right? I mean, since Brown versus Board of Education, we see more segregation in public education. We have a Civil Rights Act, but we still see that people are barred from voting, and there's voter suppression. So it's one step in a process. It's one tool that we're using in the toolbox as organizers, but we also know that we're going to have to continue to push so that the concessions that we get with legislation are not just concessions, but they actually have real material benefit in this push for change. It's a systemic issue, so lots of systems have to change. But this particularly is important for me as a mother who experienced homelessness with my children, and knowing how I had to just jump through all kinds of hoops to make them think we were on vacation, to when we were staying in hotels or I'm sorry.
Take your time.
This has such an impact on people's lives. And even in all of my privilege, struggling with trying to make a way for your family through homelessness, it's something that I wouldn't wish on anyone. It has long-term impacts on brain development. It has impacts on your mental health. And we've seen with the studies that people who experience homelessness also struggle, right? And the children who experience homelessness often repeat those same cycles. And it is imperative for us to break that, because every human deserves a right to thrive. Everyone. So we've got to make this real. We've got to make this real. I was, after one meeting that I was having late in the night last year, so it was maybe September 2019. I had food left over from the meeting, so I went to the closest encampment to my office, which was a block away, a sprawling encampment that took up an entire city block. And I pulled in. It was late. It was maybe around 10 p.m. Pitch black. It'd been raining. It was cold, and I pulled into the encampment in front of the containers that hold the trash, and my headlights hit the garbage container and reflected off, and rats just scurried everywhere. So it was freezing, and I said, you know, people are living in this, and even though I have a fear of rodents, I have to swallow that because people are living here. So my discomfort is irrelevant compared to what they're experiencing every single day. So I got out of my car with the bag of food. The ground is soft with wood chips and dead rats. And as soon as I opened my car door, I heard an infant cry. And because I'm a mother, I know the difference between an infant and a toddler and an older child. So there was an infant living in an encampment with rats, no running water, no ability to shelter, with trash everywhere in the United States of America. That has got to stop. So AB 10, if it's a roadway, if it's a path forward, we've got to make it happen. And everything in between, from civil disobedience, direct actions, everything that we need to do to stop that reality is what I'm willing to do. And all of the mothers that I'm organizing with are committed to doing, to make housing a human right, and not just a rhetorical slogan that we use when we're doing actions, but a material reality that actually impacts people's lives and allows all of us to thrive. And I'm done. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Carol. And I think, you know, I don't think any of us could say it better. You know, that housing as a human right means that nobody ever has to tell those stories to their kids. No mother should have to make up stories that they're going on vacation for their kids. That it's not just the four walls around you that are so important. It's the mental and emotional security and the dignity that, you know, that comes with it, and that nobody should ever have questioned. And I think you're also right that the you know, it is just one step, and we have seen, you know, we saw at the end of Martin Luther King's career that he said we've moved from an era of civil rights to an era of human rights. because he'd seen the gains that, the movement thought it had made with Brown v. Board, they'd gotten legal equality and desegregation, but it wasn't happening in practice, that, we needed an actual right to adequate housing, not just a right to non-discrimination in inadequate housing. And so I think that's the lesson that, we're seeing more and more today. So thank you so much for your story. Thank you for your organizing. And thank you for helping to launch this movement in California, which I'll transition over to Assembly Member Rob Bonta, who helped to pick up this torch as you were sharing it and passing it along, who is the Assembly Member for California's 18th District, which he's been serving since 2012, representing the cities of Oakland, Alameda, and San Leandro. He's the first Filipino-American state legislator in California's history. His parents worked for the United Farm Workers of America, organizing Filipino and Mexican-American farm workers, which ultimately led him to Yale College and working his way through Yale Law School, on his way to becoming a deputy city attorney for the city and county of San Francisco, and then on into other public service in Alameda before becoming elected to the Assembly. And we thank him so much for working with us, working with the moms and ACE to introduce AB 10. And now he's on his way back from Sacramento traveling, so he can't be on video. But he's here by phone, and we're excited to hear from him what this bill means to him, what it could mean for the state of California, and some of the lessons that he's learned kind of along the way on working on this bill. So, Assemblymember Bonta.
Hey, thanks, Eric. Can you guys hear me okay?
We can hear you. Go ahead.
Wonderful. Well, good to see you. Sorry you can't see me. I wish I could be on a video with you all. You're stuck with an old stock photo of me. But I appreciate you. I wanted to be on this call from the beginning when I saw who was going to be on it and what you were going to talk about, because I'm just so proud to be on this panel with all of you and with the leadership you've shown for so many years. Appreciate you, Eric, and the National Law Center for Homelessness and Poverty for inviting me to participate. And of course, I always have to give a shout out to Carol Fife and Ace, my Woman of the Year this year. And just someone who's so inspiring for me and passionate and helps push me and make me be better and more aggressive in my role. So appreciate you, Carol. And thanks for sharing your story with us today. So a couple questions I got that I want to try to address. One was what brought me to the idea that housing is a human right. And, one of the ways I approach my job is I always try to view our world through an equity lens and help the most vulnerable, the people that need it most, are voiceless, and provide better opportunities and a floor of decency and dignity and humanity for everyone to have. And that's taken a number of different forms for me. I've been very focused on healthcare and healthcare as a human right. I've long been saying and believing that I believe healthcare is a right, not a privilege. It's for all, not the few. And it to me, it's a basic component of being a human being. And so is housing. And as I've seen the crisis deepen, as I've seen the pain and anguish, as I've heard the stories, and seen the violence that it's delivered, the lack of access to adequate housing, and our growing homelessness crisis on families, and as Carol so articulately shares around children, and folks that really are the folks who how we care for them should be how we're judged, how we're taking care of our vulnerable community, our children, our sick, our poor, our seniors, and we're not. And housing is fundamental. It's if you look at Maslow's hierarchy of basic needs, you have food and air and water, and you have shelter. and it's necessary to be able to survive. And we want people, of course, not just to survive, but to thrive. So, and then, the moms for housing really just amplified the volume to a level that everyone had to listen to. Everyone was compelled by it won over, hearts and changed attitudes, and really laid bare the inequity and the unfairness with what's happening. And I believe the moms made the moral case, at least in the 18th Assembly District and the Bay Area in California, for housing as a human right. And so one of the things that I have the ability to do, sort of my unique role and opportunity to help people, is through changing our laws and changing our rules. And I felt the moms made the moral case, and I wanted to make the legal and constitutional case, and that they should be combined and they should work together, and that our foundational document in California, the statement of our values and who we are and what we stand for and who we'll be and how we care about one another, should have housing as a human right in it. And so that's kind of my path. But a lot of it happened recently. We had been working on some really important legislation and work, a lot of it with ACE, including AB 1482, the strongest tenant protections in the state, history of the state, strongest in the nation, just cause protections, anti-rent gouging. But really, when the moms came on the scene, took their courageous action, their acts of civil disobedience, their statements of values and who we are, who we should be, that really helped cement it for me. And I've been learning about your work since then, the work of others around the nation, around the world. And there's not a state that's had housing as a human right. In the United States, California prides itself in being first and being values driven. So we should be doing it here. And it is important to not see housing as a human right as an aspirational goal, but certainly it is an aspirational goal, but something that needs to be put into law is what our goal should be. That's what makes it real. The idea isn't just to talk about a concept or an ideology, although that's important to talk about along the way. The importance, I think we all would agree, is to help people and deliver the support and conditions of living that people deserve, because they're fellow human beings. And that requires accountability, that requires teeth, that requires oversight, that requires real laws with real power. And so that's why I think we should have a constitutional amendment. And that's why I think it's important to take the values that we hold and put them into law. And, it's definitely, as we all know, and has been mentioned, COVID-19 has really shown how a pre-existing crisis of homelessness and housing affordability is even more exacerbated, and it shows how the fight for housing as a human right is needed now more than ever. Folks who were vulnerable and teetering on the edge have fallen off. Folks that were already struggling with homelessness and housing affordability are in even worse conditions. So the dire conditions have worsened. The urgency level has been raised. The need for housing as a human right in California is even more important. So, and it's been said before, how can you shelter in place if you don't have shelter? How can you stay at home, follow a stay-at-home order if you don't have a home? There are assumptions built into those decisions by public health directors, and they're not true for everybody. There are people who are very vulnerable, very exposed, in great need of help and support. And if we're to be the state that we want to be and believe we are, we need to do better, and we need to have housing as a human right in our Constitution. And then finally, what have I learned about trying to move this constitutional amendment forward, and including some of the resistance from folks who you would expect to be natural allies, is that there's a lot of education that's needed. People have assumptions about what it means to have housing as a human right in the Constitution. They think that it will create unbearable financial burdens immediately on the state, a state that's going through a financial crisis right now created by a pandemic. They think it will create endless lawsuits by trial attorneys. They think it's merely aspirational and quote unquote doesn't really do anything. And it's none of those things. It's the way we phrased it. We phrased it carefully, with every word having a deep meaning that allows for aggressive and real, tangible change to occur, but not to do it in a way that will bankrupt a state or create, lawsuits and tie folks up in court forever. And so we need to explain what it means to have a public right of action. We need to explain what it means to fulfill the right with an aggressive but reasonable time frame. Those all have meaning, and if they're in the Constitution, they can be enforced and they can be overseen by courts to create real change. So a lot of it has been a challenge of education. I'm learning as well about the best pathways and how to address concerns, and certainly those who aren't following as closely have a steep learning curve too. But I think we will get there. I know we will. It'll just take time and education and the commitment and passion that we all collectively share. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Assembly Member. That's really useful and perfectly segues us into the next section, which is looking at the human right to housing comparatively. So if California does amend its constitution to include the right to adequate housing, what would that mean? As you're saying, it's a floor to build on top of, and the building would be done through our regular democratic legislative processes. It doesn't remove the authority of the legislature, but it means that there's a check on those processes and accountability for continuing to keep things moving in the right direction. And there's no need to fear that it dictates a specific approach. A comparative analysis looking at other countries shows where they do have housing as a constitutional or statutory right. There's a really wide variety of structural and institutional means by which the right can be guaranteed. There's no one-size-fits-all model, but many democracies have this right, and they have been effectively implementing it. And so this variety of these means really demonstrates that the concerns that are raised that you just kind of laid out in terms of the cost, in terms of the litigation threat, the fear of what the judiciary might be doing with it, all of these are practical hurdles that can be overcome. And so I'm going to share just very briefly a couple of examples of what this looks like in practice in some other places. No one is doing it perfect. Nobody has fully implemented the right, but there are countries that are further along that have lessons that they can teach us about how to do this. And first up, we'll talk about Scotland. In Scotland, the Homelessness Act of 2003 provides that if you become homeless and you go to your local housing authority and say, I'm homeless, there is a mandatory duty on them to provide you immediately with some sort of temporary accommodation, and then within a certain period of time, 90 days, to get you into a permanent housing situation that is going to be suitable for your needs, physical needs, disability, or your proximity to your work, safety standards, et cetera. It has to be fully adequate and appropriate for the individual who's coming forward. And because this duty is put onto the local authorities, this actually gives them an incentive to come up with means of preventing homelessness, including creating more affordable housing so that they don't have this duty triggered, and preventing homelessness through other means. So for example, the law also requires landlords and banks, if they are going to go into an eviction or foreclosure proceeding, that they first have to notify the state that this is going to be happening, so that then the state can reach out and potentially provide rental assistance or mortgage assistance so that that person can just stay in their home rather than be transitioned over into homelessness. So it's really, it has that immediate duty and it has that provision for individuals, but the impacts of that individual duty are more systemic. It does have a very broad definition of homelessness, so it's not just people who are living on the streets, but those who have no place where they can legally or safely reside. So people who are being threatened with domestic violence or something like that, there's if they can't be there because of overcrowding or something, those are still situations that qualify people for benefits. The one other thing that's very unique about Scotland's approach and that could really benefit a place like California is that it had a phased implementation. So it started off with there being priority need categories, families with children, people exiting the justice system, people with disabilities, things like that. But as time progressed, those priority tests became fewer and fewer until it was kind of available to everyone. And that allowed the mechanisms for the implementation to gear up, and it allowed the society as a whole to realize, this isn't a disaster for us. This is working in practice, and you can see that in the graph here on the slide, initially applications went up as the program rolled out, and instead of seeing that as a fault of the program, the state actually welcomed that. It said, we are reaching the people who need to be reached. It wasn't seen as a bad thing that the numbers were going up, but then the numbers kind of steadily went down as the duty started reaching more and more people. And it hasn't gone away entirely. People are still becoming in need, but as they get in need, the duty is making sure that those people are caught, that the safety net catches them. And so the end result of that is that right now there's very few people who are sleeping rough, as they say over there, who are actually on the streets. So it has been making progress. It's not perfect, but it has been helpful in making concrete difference in the enjoyment of the right to housing in people living in Scotland's lives. Next example I want to share is Finland, which has a constitutional right to housing, and this right is implemented in a different way. It has a committee that is designated within the parliament to pre-review legislation before it goes out to make sure it's constitutionally compliant. And if it isn't, if this is a law is proposed that would take the society backwards from its progressive goal to meet the right to housing, then that committee is empowered to hold hearings to figure out what needs to be done to amend it, and then only legislation which is constitutionally compliant, including with this right to adequate housing, is then able to be introduced into law. And so it really helps to set that floor, but it doesn't mandate anything specifically. So it doesn't mandate more public housing. It doesn't mandate more vouchers. It's very flexible. It obligates, there's an obligation of results that you need to be getting closer to the right to adequate housing, but it's not an obligation of specific prescriptive measures. That's still flexible within what the society needs. And through this, we've seen that Finland and Helsinki in particular has taken real strides, and street homelessness is almost non-existent now in Finland. And so this, again, is a really concrete example of how this kind of amendment could be put into practice and could make a practical difference. Last, I want to talk about France, which has a statutory right to housing that is modeled very similarly to the Scottish right to housing law. This also provides an individual entitlement to shelter. If you present yourself, then you are entitled to shelter. There's a very broad definition of homelessness, again, to make sure that it's not just the people who are physically on the streets, but also those with inadequate housing who are being threatened in other ways are captured. And in order not to kind of open up the floodgates to widespread litigation in a judicial setting, there's an administrative commission that's set up for individual enforcement. And where the commission finds that there's a lot of people who are becoming homeless, who aren't getting their rights met under this duty, it also is empowered to impose sanctions, to withhold government funding for certain things. And so it gives, again, that kind of incentive for the local communities to be able to actually step up and be providing levels of affordable housing and adequate housing in their communities that's actually needed. And that's, I think, what we've seen in California hasn't been happening at all. There's always these studies that show, blue ribbon panels that say, we're not producing enough affordable housing, we need to do things different, but somehow that never happens. And so this kind of an approach can give that accountability to actually make those things that we know need to happen and stop kicking the can down the road. So those are just a few very quick examples of different ways this right is being implemented. And we are happy to talk more about that. We have some more materials about that on our website if folks want to go there to nlchp.org. And you can click on our publications materials and look at human rights, and there's a wealth of materials there to go more in depth. But I just wanted to give this very quick example to say this is doable in practice. With that, I'm going to transition over and talk a little bit about our upcoming webinars. We've got a whole series lined up going all the way into the fall every other week, looking at everything from racial equity, policing and incarceration, renters' rights, federal funding, a whole wealth of subjects coming up. We may alter this as events warrant, but there's a whole series, and so we encourage you to keep coming back to our website. We'll put the link into your follow-up email so you can register for the next one. So now, just very quickly, we didn't put any polls in this webinar, so we will skip over these questions, apparently. And the last thing I wanted to say is that this crisis is forcing us to see and truly understand that we are all interconnected, and without housing or sanitation or services, our neighbors who are on the front lines of a deadly pandemic are going to continue to be there unless we continue our work towards lasting solutions. They will continue to be on the front lines and being taken down by that. So this crisis has shown us that there are effective ways and inexpensive ways of providing housing as a human right, and we must ensure that we don't go back to an inadequate status quo, but that we do better for our communities moving forward. So I hope you'll consider supporting the Law Center's work towards both those immediate and permanent, long-lasting solutions. And with that, we've gone a little bit over time, I see, but we can talk about some of the questions that have come in. If folks can stay on the line. And one of the first ones I see is one that I think, Leilani, you can answer well, and we'll give you a chance to talk about some of your new work. What correlations have been made and are being made between the rates of homelessness and corporations and big business?
Yeah, that's a good question. No correlation, unfortunately. I mean, if I understand the question correctly, are the dots being connected? And my experience is they are not. Though my own experience as a researcher and human rights lawyer and as rapporteur has been that, you know, there's a pretty direct line between the financialization of housing and growing homelessness. And it's why we're seeing growing homelessness and, you know, different populations emerging in affluent countries. Because it's the affluent countries where financialization has really taken hold in a very particular way that has resulted in escalating rents, people not being able to afford those rents, people self-evicting often. I hear that a lot in California for fear of being put on one of those lists. If you're at all in the eviction, and that might be national, I don't know, but if you're in the eviction courts at all system, that can screw you, excuse the expression, as a tenant. And so people self-evict and then they're out and they realize, oh my gosh, I can't afford anything in my hood or even near my hood. And then it's like, what am I going to do? Do I move really far away and lose my job? Or do I couch surf with friends and family? Often that's the route. And then that's a quick road to street homelessness. And I heard that story from so many different people, but are very many people making those connections? I don't think so, unfortunately. That's the role of the film Push, actually. It's part of what the documentary film that was produced that I happened to be in, it's sort of about that. It doesn't get into the deep analysis on homelessness, but it does try to connect those dots. Unfortunately, Push was supposed to have its theatrical debut in the US on April 29th in New York. So that didn't happen. And we're now looking at a way to try to roll out the film in the US because the film is so relevant to the US context. And it's a global film. It's filmed in a whole bunch of different places, but it does include a section, not on California actually, but in New York. In any event, those are important connections to be made. And I think we as advocates need to keep making those connections.
Yeah, and yeah, I was trying to give you an opportunity to push the film, so I'm glad you got back there.
There you go. I did get to the film.
Yeah. And the organization that you're now the director of, dedicated to kind of amplifying that message that, you know, we need to make a shift from housing as a commodity to housing as a human right.
Yeah, I mean, I will just say, if I might, Eric, I'll just say one thing about the shift. I mean, in fact, the shift was born out of the lack of connection between a whole bunch of different things, but in particular, we were concerned with the fact that housing had become this uber commodity and a financial instrument, really, for many. And we realized that as advocates and people living this and concerned citizens, et cetera, we don't have money as our power and our strength, and we don't have a seat at the political table in the way that these guys do. Like, you know, Steve Schwartzman, the head of Blackstone, is Donald Trump's chief economic advisor. So we don't have that kind of power and strength. But if we banded together in numbers, and not just the usual suspects, not just us advocates, you know, and right to housing, but if we banded together with local governments, or, you know, subnational level governments, with architects, with urban planners, with academics, with grant makers, progressive people in the finance industry, if we all banded together to claim the single claim that housing is a human right, we might be able to push back on these very powerful actors. That's how the shift, the organization, was born, as a matter of fact.
Great, thank you so much. That's where I was hoping we'd go. And I'll also promote your fantastic report as special rapporteur on the financialization of housing, and just looking at how this financialization of housing has damaged us. How, you know, we went from the housing crisis of 2007 and 8, and people losing their housing and then those houses being bought up by the very same venture capitalists that caused the housing crisis in the first place and turned into rental units that they're then bundling together and are going to cause another crisis, and it's not being treated, it's not being adequately regulated. And so the right to housing doesn't just mean, more public housing or social housing. It also means appropriate regulation of the market so that the private market doesn't force people out of housing, and that's part of a governmental duty. We have a ton of other questions. We definitely won't have time for all of them. So I apologize for that in advance, and we'll make sure that we get answers back to folks and get these questions to our panelists. Is Assembly Member Bonta still on? Can't see immediately. Assembly Member Bonta, are you still there?
Yeah, I'm here. Can you hear me?
Yep, we can hear you. So thank you. We have I'll try and go through one more question for kind of each of the panelists that's been directed in their directions. We've got a question thanking you for your support and your legislative work on this issue. And then wondering if legislation requiring homeless shelters to have more process before they kick people out, an independent grievance system rather than within the homeless shelter itself, who might retaliate, and that could also expand to other congregate housing settings like nursing homes or group homes. There's kind of, this is another aspect of the right to housing is, your legal security to actually stay wherever you are, whether that housing is, single family or apartment or this kind of congregate public setting. So if you could speak to that issue at all, somebody say.
Thank you. That's definitely an area of debate and discussion. We have some leaders who do support the right to housing and housing as a human right, who think that everybody should be brought indoors and not be in a congregate setting that is potentially outdoors. If it's a congregate setting in a shelter, that's another possibility. But the constitutional right to housing and housing as a human right put in the California Constitution is deliberately and intentionally meant to be general, but with enough specification to address some of the immediate concerns. And then a lot of the detail, including probably some of the detail in this question as to how congregate settings will be addressed, whether it's that setting or another setting for housing, how grievances will be addressed. Those should be done in follow-up legislation, pursuant to the constitutional amendment to make the Constitution real. So, for example, we have also in the constitutional amendment now a public right to action, not a private right, a public right. So, like an inspector general, potentially attorney general. Think of a public guardian or public ombudsman or someone of that nature who has a public role, that requires additional legislation to create that role, create its terms and conditions, its contours, its metes and bounds. So a lot of the detail will be in the follow-up legislation, but what we won't be able to turn away from is the fact that there is legislation that's required to be made. It's not optional. It's not a matter of if you do it. It's a matter you have to do it. It's just a matter of what it is and what those details are. So that's kind of how we see the legal framework between the constitutional amendment and the follow-up legislation. And I think this question would probably be answered with the follow-up legislation.
That's a perfect answer. Exactly how it should be done. That the amendment sets the floor again, and then the legislature figures out the details on how to build on that floor to ensure the right, but that it can't, there is a sense of accountability there to make sure that it gets done. Carol, I'll give you the last question here, coming from somebody in Seattle who says that, the fights over encampments of unhoused individuals are causing high levels of tension between Asian American and Black communities as we all struggle to combat white supremacy. The City of Seattle government has consistently responded with sweeps that result in the destruction of property and continued displacement of unhoused populations without addressing the underlying causes. Do you have any recommendations for addressing this issue of different marginalized groups being pitted against one another?
I wish I could speak to that person. I don't want to make assumptions around where the marginalization, which groups are homeless and which groups are housed. So I think there, once again, as we spoke about earlier, there's a lot of education that needs to be done around who the enemy is, because the enemy is not each other, like different levels of folks who are lower in this caste system of players. So I think that leads to a lot of tension here. I can speak specifically around California. When we go to Sacramento to lobby for any kind of renter protections, once again, I don't want to make assumptions about the race of the folks in Seattle, but we have experienced challenges in Sacramento around Asian folks and Black folks and Latino folks, with Asians representing a large portion of homeowners and landlords. And so what we've done is reached out to our progressive Asian groups here locally to say, we need to be in partnership and in coalition. Can you reach out to your folks so we can have some space where we have conversations around speculation and financialization being the issue and not each other, because of the history of housing policies that have been problems for all of us. We have a lot of Chinese and Vietnamese groups that we work with that work for affordable housing measures and work around anti-homelessness measures. And we try to pull them into the conversation to say, we're Black and brown folks. We don't speak the language. You do. We're in coalition together. Can you go and talk to the Landlords Association? Can you go and be the intermediary while we're building this larger bridge of educating the public that we're pit against each other, right? Some folks who have been able to make some strides and get housed get really frustrated when they see that other people haven't. And they demonize the individual when it's really the systems that are failing all of us. Some people are able to achieve inside of these structures and get a couple things and acquire a couple homes, but we shouldn't be trying to hoard and just acquire property. It should be available to everyone. So if they understood, if landlords understood, if people who own homes understood that it is not the individuals who haven't been able to succeed in a rigged system, that the whole system is rigged, that allows a few people to achieve, then we would understand that there's one boogeyman, and that's the 0.5% of a 1%, and the folks that are engaged in this speculative process, this commodification of housing, commodification of what should be a human right. That's the target, not each other. So I would say definitely reach out to some of the progressive groups we work with. APEN in California, we have a statewide relationship with APEN, APAL. There's a lot of different Asian groups who are on the right side of this, and they need to get their folks. We talk about white folks in the same way. Go get your folks while we're building these bridges on the other side. We're not enemies of each other.
That's a great note to end on, and I think brings us back to this idea that housing is a human right. Human rights don't have any limitations based on race, on ethnicity, and documentation. And it's a universal framework that works for everybody. And so yet another reason why it's really important to have this conversation about housing as a human right, not just a civil right, not just a social justice issue. but as a human rights issue. So with that, we've got lots of other questions. I apologize to everybody we haven't been able to get to, but we're well over time now. So I will wrap up, and I promise we'll get back to the folks we haven't been able to address, and you can keep following along the conversation using, follow us on Twitter at NLCHP Homeless. You can get more materials at our Housing.Handcuffs and NLCHP.org website, and we will continue this conversation until we do make housing a human right here in the U.S. So thank you to all of our presenters, and thank you to everybody who's been listening.